बंधन काट मुकुट गुर कीना.
Hello, welcome to Introduction to the Sikhs. This is lecture 4. We're going to start on a relatively long excursion into Sikh history. And today we'll start with some background and then the beginnings of the Sikh tradition. And we've already talked about the Sikhs as a religious community. We've described their beliefs and practices. And we noted that it's only about 500 years old. And so it's a relatively recent history, but it's one that's been action-packed. And the history of the Sikhs has been very important to the community, and it really is very much alive in the memories of the Sikh community. So the Sikh community began with Guru Nanak, and he lived from 1469 to 1539. Because of the recency of this history, we have pretty accurate dating of the lives of the gurus and events in Sikh history. But before describing Guru Nanak's role in the founding of the community, I want to provide actually quite a bit of historical context, because that will be very important in understanding how the Sikh community got where it is today. So here's probably an 18th century painting of Guru Nanak, and just to show you a depiction. So he's in the upper right with the white beard. He's talking to another religious person, having a debate about religious ideas. And at the bottom of the painting is actually someone known as Bhai Mardana, and he's another historical figure who accompanied Guru Nanak on his travels, which I'll describe a little later. And Mardana is holding a musical instrument called a rabab. It's a plucked stringed instrument. So to give you historical background, I actually want to start in Europe, because Europe is what most people in the West are familiar with, European history. And ultimately, European history will have a major impact on what happens in South Asia and on the history of the Sikhs. So within Europe itself, if we take a sort of Anglo-Saxon-centric view of things, one date that I've learned as a child growing up in India was 1066, the Norman invasion of Britain. Another important date was the signing of the Magna Carta, which laid the basis for modern democracies, 1215. That's, of course, well before the birth of Guru Nanak, but it will line up with some other events that I'm going to describe to you as background. In 1455, the Gutenberg Bible was printed, and of course this represented the beginnings of a major revolution in Europe in terms of economy and society and politics. And for those of you who are watching this in America, of course, you're familiar with the date 1492 when Christopher Columbus reached America. And of course, we know that he was trying to reach what were then called the Indies, which would include Southeast Asia and South Asia. And he never made it, of course. But just a few years later, in 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama did reach the southwestern coast of what is now India. Now, if we actually look at the following dates, the next date actually overlaps with Guru Nanak's life, and that's 1521 when Martin Luther was excommunicated in Germany, and this was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. And this is interesting because I think there's some parallels with what was going on in South Asia at the time. Of course, they were completely independent developments, but you see similar kinds of religious ferment in Europe and in South Asia in the beginning of the 16th century. in Europe, this was also a time of economic expansion and a rise in the the power of the Catholic Church. And one marker of that is in 1590 is the completion of the Dome of St. Peter's. So this increase in wealth and power was again based on economic expansion in Italy, in particular with the Italian city-states. Meanwhile, the seeds of democracy in 1215 with the Magna Carta were exhibiting themselves in the overthrow of the English monarchy in 1649. And the monarchy was restored just a few years later, but this had a long-run impact on British politics and also where we are today in terms of how we think about governance. And I'll tie these in again to the experience in South Asia and the Sikh experience. The 17th century, so I've put a couple of dates roughly capturing events where the British East India Company was establishing itself in South Asia. And it started out with trading posts, and by the 18th century, actually just after this, it was actually controlling parts of South Asia and effectively acting as a government in South Asia, even though it was just a private corporation. So now I'm going to turn from Europe to South Asia, and before I give you some of the relevant historical background in South Asia, I just want to illustrate some key features of the geography of South Asia. South Asia has very, very significant river plains. There's the Indus Valley, which had an ancient civilization, and the name India, of course, comes from the same root as Indus. And then you also have a northern plain, the Gangetic Plain, where the river Ganges flows from. And both these rivers flow from the Himalayan mountains to the sea. And the Himalayas are, in fact, as you may know, the highest mountains in the world. Now, to the northwest of the Himalayas in what is now the border of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, there are still relatively high mountains, but there's also a passageway through those mountains, and that is known as the Khyber Pass. So in this slide, you can see a map of South Asia. Then you can see a map of Pakistan, and there's a red circle there, which shows you where the Khyber Pass is located. And the photograph on the right shows you the highway. So there's actually enough of a gap in the mountains to have a modern paved highway through there. So 500 years ago, or even before that, the highway wasn't there, but it still represented a relatively easy passageway from Central to South Asia. And historically, this pathway represented a sequence of enabled a sequence of migrations from Central Asia into South Asia. And that's where we're going to pick up part of the story that of those migrations that is going to provide background for Sikh history. So in this context, I want to say a little bit about Islam. Islam was, of course, founded in the 6th century in Arabia, modern-day Saudi Arabia, and it started to spread quite rapidly. By the 7th century, Arab traders were already settling on the southwest coast of India. And in 711, Arabs actually conquered what is now the province of Sindh now in southwestern Pakistan. So this represented is Muslim settlement into South Asia for the first time, relatively soon after the founding of Islam. So those presences came through sea routes, but by the beginning of the 11th century, one started to have invasions from Afghanistan and Central Asia. Mahmud of Ghazni was a repeated invader of India, and his goal was just to come in to these fertile, rich river plains to loot or to loot and plunder, and then return to his homeland. That changed about a century and a half later, in 1192, when Muhammad of Ghor, or Muhammad Ghori, conquered northern India. And this was the beginning of a series of Islamic rulers of northern India. So this was known as the Delhi Sultanate. The rulers were sultans. And we had 5 Turkic or Afghan dynasties. And here Turkic refers to Central Asian Turks, which I'll illustrate for you in a moment. So now in 1526, there's a change in in who rules India. It's still Muslim rulers, but the Delhi Sultanate is overthrown by someone named Babur. And in 1526, Babur conquered India and established what became the Mughal Empire. Mughal is actually a word that you might be familiar with in English in the context of the word Mughal. Sometimes it's used to describe, powerful people in Hollywood moguls. And it comes from this word Mughal. Mughal itself comes from Mongol. And Babur was descended on one side of his family from the legendary or famous Mongol emperor and conqueror Genghis Khan. And actually on the other side, he was descended from another famous conqueror, maybe less well known than Genghis Khan in the West, Timur. And Timur was actually of Turkish origin. The Mughal Empire was one of the most important and richest empires in human history. And it technically lasted for over 300 years. The last Mughal emperor was only deposed in 1858, deposed by British colonists. But it had declined well before that. So the Mughal Empire is right up there with, say, the Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire in terms of the great empires of human history. And I'm bringing in all of this history because the Mughal Empire and its presence in India and its actions in India are very important for shaping Sikh history and understanding Sikh history and even the Sikh present. So here's a map of Central Asia. You can see there are 4, this is with modern national boundaries. You can see there are 4 Turkic republics or republics where the majority of people are of Turkic ethnicity. That's Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And there's another Central Asian republic which has a different dominant ethnicity, the Tajiks, and that is Tajikistan, the little blue one. And then you have just below these, you have Afghanistan, which is, of course, very familiar to Westerners because it's in the news so much. And the main ethnic group in Afghanistan is Pashtuns, but it also has Tajiks and Turks and many other groups. So another aspect of Islam that is very important in the context of understanding the origins of Sikhism is Sufism. Sufism, to simplify somewhat, is a mystical strand of Islam, and a follower of Sufism is known as a Sufi. One of its key ideas is subsuming the self in worship of the divine, and here you might draw some parallels with Sikh ideas and the goal of Sikhs as submerging or getting rid of home, the ego or self, feeling of self. So Sufism actually originated in the Middle East, in Arabia, soon after the founding of Islam. But then over time, it established a strong presence in India. It was organized in different orders. There were many varieties of Sufism, so it wasn't all a uniform set of movements, and each order typically had a religious leader. Again, one can possibly draw parallels with religious orders in Europe, both within Catholic and Protestant traditions. A very important Sufi mystic was Sheikh Farid, and we actually don't have a very good dating for him, so dates for Sheikh Farid range from the 12th century to the 16th century. He was actually a very important poet, Sufi poet as well, and his verses are included in the Guru Granth Sahib, which is where the obvious connection of Sikhism and Sufism comes through. Just to give you a sense of Sufism in a way that a Westerner might encounter Sufism, is Sufi devotional music, which has the musical form called Qawwali. And Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan was a modern singer of South Asian Sufi devotional music, and he became extremely popular in the West. And he actually passed away a couple of decades ago, but when he was alive, he could actually fill even stadium-sized concert venues with the power of his singing. So I'd like to play a clip for you of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan singing Qawwali. And this clip is interesting and significant because he's singing verses from the Guru Granth Sahib. And these verses were written not by one of the gurus, but by someone named Kabir, who I'll describe a little later. What is also interesting about this clip is that he's singing in a Gurdwara, a Sikh place of worship. And it shows, it illustrates the eclectic nature of Sufism and also the openness of the Sikh tradition. So now I'll tell you where Kabir fits into South Asian tradition. And this involves talking about the bhakti movement. So bhakt literally means devotee, and bhakti therefore means devotion. In Punjabi, the word would be bhagat, and this was, historians suggest that this was a movement that arose in the South Asian context within the Hindu tradition as somewhat as a response to the presence of Islam. So this it's not a very formal movement in the sense that there's not a lot of organization. There are various independent figures, and they're spread over several centuries. So one of the earliest is Namdev, who lived in the 13th, 14th centuries. And then Ravidas, who lived in the 15th century. And then Kabir, who is perhaps the best known and most significant of the Bhagats. And he lived in the mostly in the 15th century, though some scholars suggest he lived a little earlier than the dates that I've put up there. So actually the verses of more than a dozen of the Bhagats, including Kabir, Ravidas, and Namdev, are included selectively in the Guru Granth Sahib. And I'll talk about that process in a minute. But the Bhagats, well, let me address that here. So the Bhagats often rejected caste, and they often emphasized the nature of the divine as being beyond attributes. And this is known in particular as Nirgun Bhakti. Nirgun means without any attributes. This is in contrast to Sagun Bhakti, where you still had Bhakts who followed the model of direct personal devotion to God without the necessity of intermediaries like Brahman, priests, and so on. But they worship God. The Sagun Bhagats worship God in some kind of physical form. In the Hindu tradition, you have, for example, Vishnu. Let me say Vishnu is an aspect of God, and then he has avatars on earth like Ram and Krishna and so on. So that is Sargun, in fact, Vaishnav Bhakti. And that part of Bhakti is not included in the Guru Granth Sahib. So the Guru Granth Sahib, the Bhagats that are included are really those whose teachings and conception of the divine is in alignment with what the Sikh Gurus were postulating. So now let's finally turn to Guru Nanak. And here's a map of the plains of Punjab that I've shown you in a previous lecture. And I've put a little red circle to indicate roughly where Guru Nanak's birthplace was. And now it is known as Nankana Sahib, Nankana being of Nanak, meaning of Nanak, and Sahib being an honorific term, a term of respect. And so Nankana Sahib is not too far from the city of Lahore, which existed at the time of Guru Nanak and was the provincial capital. And it is now, of course, in modern Pakistan. So I'll give you an overview of Guru Nanak's life. He was born in a middle-class family. He had a normal upbringing. He got married, had a job. He was also relatively well educated in the sense that he was fluent he was literate and fluent, and we know that because he wrote down his own verses. So, according to tradition, at the age of about 30, Guru Nanak had a mystical experience, and this transformed his life. Even though he was married and settled down with a job, he shifted to engaging in a couple of decades of travel all around Asia. conducting discourses with other religious leaders or bhagats and so on, Sufis, bhagats and so on. He was composing verses and singing them, and essentially seeking the truth and trying to articulate the truth as he understood it. So in writing down his verses, he actually then created the beginnings of the Sikh sacred text. What followed after these 2 decades of travel and spiritual journeys was 2 decades of community building. And what Nanak did was settle down in a community with his family, and by this time he was already a significant religious figure, and so he was surrounded by followers who became the nucleus and the beginning of the Sikh Panth. So Panth is a Punjabi word, and it means way of life or path. So this is then technically the founding of the Sikh community. And indeed, as I've said, Sikh means disciple paired with Guru, the spiritual teacher. And the term Sikh is already being used by Guru Nanak in his verses to describe his followers. Here's a 20th century painting of Guru Nanak showing him during his journeys, and he's accompanied by, in this depiction, by a couple of companions. On the left of the screen, on Guru Nanak's right, is Bhai Mardana, who you had seen in an earlier painting and who I described. So he was actually a Muslim musician, and he accompanied Guru Nanak, who would be singing his devotional verses with the rabab, this plucked string instrument. And Mardana is actually a historical figure who, indeed there's even a couple of verses of Mardana in the Guru Granth Sahib. The figure on Guru Nanak's left, on the right of the painting, is known as Bhai Bala. Bhai, if you remember, means brother and is used as a term of respect. Bhai Bala actually almost certainly did not exist, because he doesn't appear in early histories of Guru Nanak, and he shows up in the 17th century, more than a century after Guru Nanak had passed on. And one can conjecture that he was introduced into storytelling about Guru Nanak to create a kind of symmetry or balance with the Muslim companion and a Hindu companion. So Guru Nanak, just to recap, was born and grew up under the Lodi dynasty of the Delhi Sultanate, and that's why I spent some time giving you the political and historical context, because this was a system that represented several centuries of Islamic rule, and there was a well-defined hierarchy of governance and so on. And in fact, Guru Nanak's father was a local government official, and Guru Nanak was employed in that economic milieu. But after Guru Nanak had completed his travels and had already settled down and founded the Sikh community, he witnessed the invasion of the Mughal Emperor Babur, which was in 1526. And he actually wrote verses commenting on the destruction of that Babur's invasion had caused in Punjab, because, as I noted earlier, Babur, like previous Central Asian invaders, had come through the Khyber Pass and went through the plains of Punjab. Ultimately, of course, Babur made his way to Delhi, where he overthrew the Lodi Sultanate and founded the Mughal Empire. I'm mentioning these aspects of governance as well because Guru Nanak besides commenting on the invasion of Babur, also has many verses where he comments on the quality of government officials. He's very harsh about corrupt government officials, and really has an attitude where he says that the responsibility of government officials is to look after people, to promote public welfare, and he contrasts that with the corruption and oppression of government as he sees around him. So more generally, Guru Nanak, besides emphasizing personal devotion to the divine being this formless, timeless entity beyond description, Guru Nanak also emphasized the importance of living a good life, of living truthfully, emphasized ethics and social justice. And so in some sense, we can see what Guru Nanak was preaching and enjoining his followers to practice was actually a complete system. And again, one can remember the three pillars of Sikhism as a way of encapsulating these ideas. Naam japo, meditate on the divine. Kirat karo, work honestly. And vand ke chako, share with others. So when Guru Nanak was about to pass away, he actually bypassed his sons to appoint a devoted disciple as his successor. And this was the beginning then of establishing the Sikh community as a sustained, long-lasting community. And again, this was very different from the other Bhagats who had basically been individuals offering spiritual guidance, but never really thinking in terms of institutional development. By the time Guru Nanak passed away in 1539, he also had followers all over India, partly a legacy of his own travels, and partly reflection of the fact that he had his followers included many people from merchant backgrounds who would naturally travel around. So that was a very brief account of Guru Nanak's life and his founding of the Sikh community. And in some sense, it doesn't really capture the outsized influence that Guru Nanak had on Sikhism as the founder and in some sense, the fountainhead of everything. One can't overemphasize how important Guru Nanak was. But we'll be coming back to Guru Nanak's contributions throughout. And in the next lecture, I'll describe what happened after Guru Nanak's passing.